Okay, so industrial organizational psychology that we're going to talk about tonight, that's something that I have been working in or studying for a very long time, as you heard from my introduction. So what I would like to ask you guys to start things off with is what you say is, from your understanding, and I'm going to ask you a few questions as we go along through here, so be ready to respond. But what would you say, from your understanding and from the words industrial and organizational psychology, what do you think that they would do or they would study? Any ideas? Very good. Thank you for reading the title of the lecture. That's awesome. Any other more specific ideas besides that? Business. Okay, very good, because industry and organization cover business. But what exactly about that are we studying?
Leadership.
Leadership. Big topic. Yes.
Communication.
Communication to a certain extent. Yes, it certainly falls into the leadership and organization category. What else? Any other ideas? What comes to mind when you think of industrial psychology? That sounds pretty big, doesn't it? Psychology of industry?
Production.
What's that? Production, absolutely. What else? Human resources is probably the biggest one. And in fact, most people that are high up in human resources have some kind of experience in industrial and organizational psychology. Okay. It is the application of psychological principles and theories in the workplace. And this is a pretty broad idea to work with. Because when you talk about psychological principles, there's a lot of them. I mean, those of you that have gone to Psych 101, you know we cover a ton of stuff in that class. And somehow we're supposed to take all of those different and diverse ideas and apply it to the business world. It's very complex. So what do we study? Lots of things. Attitudes, interpersonal relationships, the structure and how organizations fit together. We look at the processes of motivation and leadership, which is a huge area of research. Performance within organizations, the context, the culture, where organizations come from, how they fit together, how do they work together. And also a very important aspect, matching people and jobs. We're going to talk more about these as we go through them. So, where does IO psychology come from? Well, it happens to be an official part of the American Psychological Association, the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology, SIOP, which is Division 14 of the APA. Most IO psychologists that are practitioners in the field will have obtained a PhD. That's kind of the standard. You can have a master's and work in HR, but if you really want to be a practitioner that is titled an IO psychologist, you kind of need to have a PhD. You can also get something called a PsyD in IO psychology. IO psychologists are expected to be both producers of knowledge. We generate knowledge, we study things and come up with new ideas. We're also expected to be consumers of knowledge, which are the practitioners. Practitioners, as part of what they do, will have a large part in generating knowledge as well. So I'm not going to read this, but I just thought you should have a good list of all the different things that IO psychologists do. What do they look at? What do they study? What are they interested in? And you can see, that's a big honking list. Now, I can tell you from my studies and from my work, that's not nearly a long enough list. That's not even close. I'm going to move this over here because I'm never going to stand back. There is so much, and each one of these titles can basically be its own class, its own lecture, just talking about any one of these individual topics. So this is a shorthand list of the different things that we do. Where do we do it? Well, you've seen this kind of thing before for psychology. The majority of what we do is in consulting. When you are an IO psychologist, you will mostly be tasked with consulting within organizations. Whether that means you're embedded in an organization or that means that you're with a separate organization that does nothing but consulting, you will still be working with organizations. Primarily because it's a position that isn't necessarily needed 100% of the time within an organization. If you have some things that are really troubling you as an organization, you can bring in an IO psychologist as a consultant to say, hey, help us figure out this problem really fast. And then you move on to help somebody else and you get paid lots of money for doing it. But there are also lots of private organizations that do have IO psychologists to participate, especially large organizations, big multinational or national corporations with large amounts of people. For example, I worked for a while for Bank of America. They have 500,000 employees across the nation and the world, and they have several IO psychologists on staff that help them work through their organizational difficulties. Academic being the research, primarily research side and teaching side, there's obviously a few of those. And in the public sphere, you have a few as well. Government and other organizations that are governmental or governmental adjacent. So for a little bit of history of IO psychology, it began really right at the very beginning of what we understand of the history of psychology here in the United States. And unfortunately, we are heavily involved in advertising. So a lot of the things that are annoying about advertising, guess who studied some of that stuff? Industrial and organizational psychologists. So sorry about that. But we also began studying efficiency. In the early 1900s, we're now talking about the Industrial Revolution. And so with the Industrial Revolution, we're now looking at productivity. Somebody mentioned that. And so IO psychology was very involved in understanding the nuts and bolts of productivity. How do we get people to be more productivity? What are the blockers to productivity? So you can see there's a few publications of that. In the 1920s, we continue on. We now are looking at things like, we've had World War I, and we had problems with World War I in selecting soldiers and getting them in the right places and knowing who was good to be a soldier and who wasn't. So we started developing performance rating forms. Guess what? You've all seen them. If you have a job, you've probably been rated by somebody, your manager, that says you've been doing good here, you weren't doing good here, you can improve here. Those were started in the 1920s, basically because of military assessment tests. We wanted to make sure that we were able to rate who was doing what. And we also developed developing skill and career surveys. Big area. We're going to talk about that more later. The 1930s, now we're in the Great Depression era, and we're starting to look more at working conditions. We're starting to say, okay, the organization, the environment of where work happens, how do we improve that? What do we do to help people become better in their organizations? And we start looking at worker morale and social interaction. We're actually going to do a little bit of an experiment with you guys. Not an experiment, we're going to look at an experiment that was conducted in the 1930s. That was a landmark experiment. The 1940s, the 60s, now we're talking about World War II and the development we had there. All those things we started with developing ability tests and performance ratings, boom, they explode in the 1940s with World War II. And we start to see these merging of industrial and organizational psychology into one field instead of having two separate ones. And we continue working on it. In the 1960s through the 1980s, we start looking at ethical concerns and racial differences and selection tests. And how are we selecting for people that we can now account for things like racial disparities and differences. And so we also are really now beginning study on motivations. Motivational studies are really coming to the forefront by about the 1980s. And since the 1980s today, we've continued to focus on ethical domains. Big area of research is ethical domains, and fairness and working with labor laws, and continuing work on selection, performance, appraisal, motivation is still a big area of research. So we've come a long way from advertising to studying just about everything. So here's a really famous study, the Hawthorne study from 1939. Now, what I want to do is, instead of going over this in super detail, you can read what's going on here, but what I want to focus on is they have these different things. This is what they wanted to do. They want to test workers. These are at a factory, at a light factory, so they're building light bulbs. And so they're testing light to help these workers with building these electric tools and implements. Westinghouse, I think, was the company. So they want to test groups under different light intensities. And then they have an experimental group and they have a control group. And the control group works under the same light intensity. And by the way, these are all in the same warehouse, so they know what's going on, right? One group is being tested in different light conditions, the other one is, but they know that that's what's going on because one big warehouse. The manipulation, the test group experiences 3 different light intensities. The control group, same light intensity the whole time. The expectation is that the different light intensities, as light intensity increased, we would see an increase in productivity, and the control group would stay about the same. The actual result was, yeah, we did see an increase in productivity for the test group, but it was about the same as the control group, who experienced the same amount of light intensity. So something's going on. All right, so let's try again. So the test group is now going to work under less intense light, and the control group stays the same. And we decrease the light for the test group, and we now anticipate that the test group will show a decrease in activity and the control group will stay the same. But in fact, we see the opposite. The test group increases and the control group increases. Light apparently is not the thing, but let's check again. Was the lighting expectations what were the thing was being affected by those first 2 tests? So the idea is that workers were led to believe that the lighting was being increased, but in fact it wasn't. So they told everybody, we're increasing the light. And then when they come in, it's the same. So what happens? There's no effect on productivity. This is the expectation. There shouldn't be any effect on productivity, but they might feel better. And in fact, productivity remained the same, but workers reported a favorable reaction to the increase in lighting, which there wasn't. So again, something very funky is going on. Finally, the workers' lighting expectation of the focus again, workers were led to believe that the lighting was being decreased, but it was staying the same intensity. And the anticipation was that there would be no effect on expectation on productivity, and productivity remained the same, and workers reported an unfavorable reaction to the decrease in lighting, but it didn't actually increase. So now, you've got the evidence, you've got what's going on here. What do you think is, just looking at this, what do you think is the result of this experiment? What do you think is going on? Lighting clearly isn't the factor that they thought it was. So what is the factor? What's causing the increase in productivity or the reactions to the changes in lighting? That's an excellent idea. We're not doing placebo effect could kind of account for like this bottom row where they don't change anything and they have the idea that they did, but not quite. Yeah. Competition between the 2 groups?
Well, if they knew that
Interesting.
that it would be there,
Okay.
as they saw the one increase, the other ones decide to increase as well.
That is an excellent theory. And that I hadn't considered that one when I was looking at this myself, but that's not the conclusion they came to, but that is a very, very good idea. I'm actually impressed. That's cool. That never occurred to me. What else do you think? Any ideas?
The expectations are wrong.
The expectations are definitely having an effect, right? I mean, there's something going on with expectations.
I was just gonna say, like, towards the end of the day, like, I feel like people are more productive because they need to kind of get everything done before they can go home.
Okay.
So I feel like in the morning, if you're not as productive, in order to get all your work done, you have to increase your productivity in the end of the day
Okay.
to get all of it done.
Okay. By the increase in lighting, maybe it's simulating more of a daylight thing, kind of thing. Okay, that's a possibility too. Look at what's going on. We have the lighting is what they're focusing on. But no matter what they do to the lighting, either productivity remains the same or it increases. And we also know that they were told what was going on. So there are psychological factors that are playing a role. We don't necessarily need to identify what those are. We may not be able to identify exactly what they are, but the psychological factors are playing a larger role in productivity than the lighting. So the physical environment plays a lower role than the psychological factors. After some further study, what they kind of discovered, and you can see that over here on these 2, that what really was happening was that the workers reported being more satisfied that they were being thought of. that there was consideration for the workers and their environment. They're like, yeah, that was really cool. You guys were like trying to figure out what was going to work for us. So it didn't matter what the lighting was. What mattered was that people cared. Isn't that a bizarre thing to see from an experiment like this? But when you look at the data and you start to examine it a little bit closer, yeah, it starts to show up. When they were testing them, that's all that mattered. The lighting didn't matter. Productivity went up as long as they were testing it, which said to the workers, we're concerned about what's going on. So this told everybody in IO psychology that, you know what? And this was early on, we're still kind of in that industrial psychology versus organizational psychology. When we see this, we see, wait a minute. There's a merger here. This has got to be together because we're not talking anymore about just productivity. We're now talking about organization. We're talking about how the people are treated is just as important as the environment that they're in. Pretty landmark experiment that's going on there. So let's talk about some of the specifics of what psychologists do. IO psychologists. One of the things that we do is job analysis and appraisal. Now, there's different types of job analysis. We can work on job-oriented techniques or worker-oriented techniques. And there are, well, on the job-oriented techniques, what we're going to look at is how does the job itself function? What are the responsibilities? What are the things that they have to do in the job? And that's fairly straightforward for the most part. But then there's worker-oriented techniques, which focus on what do you do while you're on the job? What is your personality like? What kind of a person are you that you either enjoy or don't enjoy that job? We want to analyze who is good at the job and who is not, and what are the characteristics about that person that goes into them. So part of that purpose of doing a job analysis is we get to discover things like job classification. What kind of a job is it? What's the type of work that's going on? Criterion development, which is pretty dang important overall because that's how you get things like your job ratings at the end of the year. It's based on criteria. What are the criterions that define success for getting the job done, both as a worker and as a job itself? You can also, again, that comes into the performance appraisals. Once you have that criterion, it leads to better performance appraisals. Selection and placement. Have you ever been in, actually, let me just have a raise of hands. Have you ever been at a job that you hated? Okay. Why did you hate it? Well, what are some of the reasons why you hated that job? Other than I had to go to the job. That's not fair. You had a job, you wanted to earn money, they were paying you good money, and yet you hated it. Why?
Supervisors.
The people you worked with. Okay, that's a big one. Yeah, no, that's it. That's huge. What else? What are some other reasons?
Workplace gossip.
Again, the people you work with. Don't get me started in office politics. What else?
Long hours with not really many breaks.
Okay, the work conditions were lousy, right? Okay, so when we go and we talk about selection and placement, we want to be able to, when we interview people, be able to tell what kind of a person are you? Is this a job that you're going to be successful at, or are you not going to be successful at it? And when we have those criteria, we are going to be better at finding the right kind of person because we can then, during the interview, say, guess what? This is a job that's going to have long hours, not many breaks, but you're getting paid well. Are you okay with that? And if you say, really? Okay, then good. Get out of here. We're going to interview somebody else. And so by understanding what the job involves helps us decide what kind of people are going to be there and who's going to be successful. And you can also do that even within an organization. You're working for an organization, you're doing well. Do you get to advance in that organization? And how do we know you're the type of person we want to advance in that organization? Because we know by the criterion what we need there. This can also lead to job design and redesign. By doing a good job analysis, and this has happened to me a couple of times where I've gone in and done an analysis of a job, and in the analysis we discovered this is not the right job. This is a two-person job. It needs to be split into two different jobs because there's way too much for one person to handle, which is why you're not having success with this job right now. People can't handle that kind of a load. So by doing a good job analysis, we discovered, nope, too much. I've also had job analysis where we look at it and go, why does this job exist? There are 3 other jobs that do the same darn thing and do it well, and this is just an adjunct to all that. There's no reason for this. And so didn't fire them. We had to move. Actually, one person quit. So yeah, I'm responsible for somebody. And of course, all that job analysis also can lead to better training by understanding what it is and working toward compensation. You do have a job that works long hours and has few breaks. My son has a job like that right now. He's a welder. He works at a metal fabrication place, and he works a 9-hour day, gets 2 15-minute breaks. That's it. And one of those is his lunch. But because he works a 9-hour day and doesn't get the breaks, he gets 2 hours of overtime every day, which is now time and a half over his $19 an hour wage. So it's like, that's fun. Okay. And he's a bottom of the rung welder. He has no experience at all. So yeah, he's going to be willing to take that because that's what he wants to do. So the compensation is aimed at things. Has anybody ever seen how much they pay at like In-N-Out for the jobs there? Have you ever seen how hard those people work at In-N-Out? The compensation matches the job, or it should. If it doesn't, then get it, because you don't want to be in the same place. Performance appraisals are another source of interesting things that go on. Performance appraisals are really they're hard to manage, they're hard to get done right, and they're hard to get people to do them right. But we need to be able to understand what the source of those performance ratings are. Is it based on productivity? Is it based on personality? Is it based on your relationships with other people? Is it related to the goals of the company or the goals of the job? You have to look at all these different things and try to find out how you want to do these ratings. And then you have to find the right format to do the ratings. And then once you have the right format, now you got to worry about, well, what if people make mistakes? You know, raise some hands, who's heard of the halo effect? And the opposite. If you don't like them, you give them a bad rating. If you like them, you give them a good rating, whether or not they actually earned that rating or not. And those errors do occur. So how do you avoid those kind of errors? What kind of training can you get to do that? And then the considerations of who's going to do the rating and why. So you can start to see this becomes a very, very complex aspect. This is just one area. We got more. We also develop tests that can predict certain things like how good you're going to be at a job. There's a company that I interviewed with just recently out of Scottsdale that does a behavioral assessment interview and a behavioral assessment test for other companies so that you can take this behavioral test and they will know what kind of a person you are and whether you will fit with the type of job they have. It's a really cool process. But you can have computer adaptive tests. Has anyone ever taken a computer adaptive test that they're aware of? Do you know what it was? Anybody? There used to be a test for Microsoft Office. You would take it was a computer adaptive test, and it would tell you to do a certain task. And if you did it correctly, it would move on to the next task. If you did it correctly, you'd move on to the next task. If you did it wrong, then it would go backwards and say, well, can you do this instead? And if you got that wrong, then that was it. Your test was now over, and you would get rated on how far you got in the test. If you ever take something like the GMAT or the GRE or one of those tests, those are also adaptive tests. The math section especially, and the vocabulary test will test increasing difficulties until you fail, and then it will try to figure out where you're at in that level. So adaptive tests are really very common. We can have speed versus power tests. How good are you or how fast are you at something? We can do individual versus group tests. I just went through an interview process for an insurance company where they interviewed a whole bunch of us at the same time. We had to all work together in this. It was kind of a weird interview, to be honest. And then pencil and paper versus performance test. If you work for UPS as a driver, guess what you will have? A performance test. Guess what that performance test is? Can you lift this? That's the performance test. Can you lift this? And they also have some organization tests. Can you track this? Can you do the job of finding the box and delivering to the right place? So they will absolutely have performance tests for them. Then there's other types of tests we can use for predictors to relatively well, predict the success of individuals in jobs. Cognitive ability, psychomotor tests, personality tests, all these different things, work samples and interviews. All of these are designed to help the employer anticipate whether or not you are going to be successful in the job that you are working towards. Some places, let me give you an example. Cheesecake Factory, right? Everybody's into Cheesecake Factory. Do you know they have an actual factory? There's 3 of them, one on the West Coast, one in the Midwest, one on the East Coast. And they produce desserts, not just for Cheesecake Factory, but also other franchises like Red Lobster and Chili's and things like that. So those places get their desserts and their breads from the factory, the Cheesecake Factory, the actual stinking factory. And I was interviewing for a job there as an instructional designer to develop training for the people that were on the floor making the cakes and all that other good stuff. And as part of my interview, they sent me a personality test that was 2 different personality tests. One of them was 280 questions long. The other one was 160 questions long, right? And then they gave me a cognitive ability test, a creativity test. Then they gave me what was the other one? There was another cognitive ability test that was testing my ability to think quickly. You can see that worked really, really well. And then when I got there, they wanted to see work samples of some of the stuff I had done for other companies, Intel, for example. And then they had an interview. After all that, now I'm being interviewed. And it was a round robin interview. They had all these different questions, and every person would ask one. I have to answer to them. They're taking notes. It's really kind of a little nerve wracking when you're in a group of 6 people and one person is talking to you and 5 people are writing notes while you're talking. Not the best thing. Not as bad as juries for singing, but pretty close. And at the end of all that, I didn't get it. And the reason I didn't get the job, by the way, was because my personality test came back wrong. They thought that I did not have the personality for what they were looking for that job. And you know what? That's what they think, then I don't want to work for them anymore. Another aspect of IO psychology is training. This has been my specialty. When you go in to do training, one of the first things you have to do is an assessment, an analysis. Do you actually need training? That's the first thing to look at. There's all kinds of things that will go into that. But we go in and we look at how does that training fit in to all these different aspects of the organization. How are we going to present this training? Can we present this training in the format? How is it going to be delivered? Who's it going to be delivered to? What is the goal? What are the metrics beyond all this stuff? And so we have this whole level of analysis that we can look at depending on what we're doing with the training. Then we have to look at the learning context. How are we going? How is it going to be designed? By the way, has anybody ever heard of something called learning styles? What are some of the learning styles? Visual.
Hands-on.
Kinesthetic.
Auditory.
Auditory. Those are the 3 main ones. And guess what? They don't matter. That's actually been something that IO Psych has studied back in the 70s. They discovered that wasn't a thing. It doesn't matter. You will learn if you need to learn, regardless of what style is presented in. But it makes a difference to how you feel about it. And so when I present it in a style that you like, you will have a better reaction to it. You won't learn any better. You might feel better about it. And so we have to look at things like that. Like the principles of learning. How are you going to feel about the training? Who are we delivering to, and what's it going to be delivered? What's the best delivery method? We also have to look at things like the characteristics of the person giving the training, or if it's a computer, how is that going to be delivered? The transfer of training. Are we going to make sure that it's going to be? Are you actually learning what we've taught you to learn, or what we want you to learn? How do we figure that out? Lots of interesting thing there. And then training delivery. All kinds of different approaches there. The largest technological development in training in the last 100 years was the development of e-learning. Asynchronous, immediately deliverable via computer learning. And everything since then has just been an adaptation of that. And guess what? Everybody wants their training to be most of the time is either computer-based or instructor-led training. And those are really the only two trainings that exist. So we have, actually this employee development-based approach is something that's a little different, where we can do mentor-based approaches or apprentice-based approaches, where you learn on the job with other people, somewhat effective in more complex jobs, to be honest. And then training evaluation. This is actually really hard to do. Let me, as an example, for training evaluation, you can evaluate, did you like the training? That's the level 1 evaluation. Level 2 is, did you learn something? And I can give you a test, and I can see, did you learn something? Next level is, are you doing the thing? It's basically a motivation level evaluation. Are we actually seeing the change we want to see? And then the last one is, was the investment of time and money worth it? ROI. And that's nearly impossible to do, but we try to do it anyway. So those are all the different ways we can evaluate whether the training was successful or not. And believe me, that is a tough one to do. Now, another aspect of it, motivation and job attitudes. Now, you guys have probably all studied a little bit about motivation in your Psych 101 classes. And we're not going to go over all the different theories of motivation here, but there are several approaches that we look at for motivation. And motivation within companies is an incredibly complex interaction. Whoops, I went the wrong one. Incredibly complex interaction between the organization, the leader, the environment, and the worker. And there are all kinds of interactions that go on there that affect whether that motivation will be successful or not, depending on the situation. So how do we adjust some of that stuff? Well, we have to look at things like make sure the organization is accounting for all those different motivational behaviors. All those, or I should say not behaviors, but interactions. We can set goals that are appropriate to get the right kind of motivation going between management and the workers. We can look at how to make your job more worthwhile, job enrichment and job crafting. We can shape jobs to make them fit to your motivations a little better. A good example of job crafting was at one company I was at, we were working with a whole bunch of graphic designers to build these training programs. And they were doing a good job, but we were losing a few. They kept quitting because they didn't enjoy what we were doing. And so we had to figure out, well, why is this going on? So the more we talked to them, we discovered that they didn't feel like they had enough autonomy in what they were doing. They wanted to have more choice in how the graphics got designed. They were given storyboards, and the control was from the designers of the training, not the people that were actually building it, the graphic designers. And so we had to craft the job a little differently and say, okay, we now want our graphic designers to be in the storyboarding sessions so that they now have some input as graphic designers, as visual thinkers, to how these could be improved. And then all of a sudden, they were much happier. They had a lot more autonomy now because they now participate in a process that heavily involved their basic skills, which is thinking visual. So we gave them that opportunity. It was a lot of fun to do that. And of course, we also want to measure job satisfaction. We want to know how good how much you enjoy your job. You would be surprised how difficult it is to accurately measure job satisfaction. If your manager at your company comes to you and says, hey, are you satisfied with your job right now? What's going to be your default answer? Yeah. Even if you're not satisfied, you still want to have a job, right? And you're not going to tell your manager, yeah, this place sucks. I don't know why people think this is the worst. You're not going to respond that way. So we have to be able to get to job satisfaction through other means that may not be as obvious. Because you're going to have some resistance to being honest about what you feel about your job. And so we have to have techniques and procedures that help us get to that without being threatening to you and your reputation in the job and your association with other people that you're working with. It's really a kind of difficult thing to work with. We also look at organizational commitment. Good example of this, which also goes back to job satisfaction. I worked with USAA for a number of years, and I worked with Bank of America for a number of years. Bank of America, their call centers for their banking and credit card has a turnover rate of 40 to 60% per year. That means that 40 to 60% of the workforce quits and moves on every year. Think about that for just a second. How would you overcome that as an organization? That's tremendous amount of training that has to go on. I have to retrain a minimum of 40% of the whole call center every stinking year. We had classes of hundreds of people that would go through all the time. We had probably 50 facilitators just running classes, keeping people pumped into the system to try to keep them there. USAA, in their call center, their turnover rate, 7% per year. That's the difference. What is the difference between those two companies? Well, it's the mission. It's the job satisfaction. USAA has a targeted group of people they work with, the military people and military families. And so when they are working with these families, they have in their hearts this deep commitment to these people that have sacrificed for their country and for the freedoms that they enjoy. And so when they're serving them in the bank, they're like, yes, thank you. You're awesome. I want to serve you because you served me. And so they have this ridiculous loyalty. I worked with a lady that had been there for 60 years. I'm not kidding. When she retired, they held a big celebration because she was like the longest person I've ever been employed there. And when she retired, she didn't want to go. They're like, no, leave. You're 80. Go. Get out of here. And she's like, no, I love it here. That's how ridiculous that kind of loyalty is, because they have job satisfaction because of one simple thing, their commitment to the job because of the job's mission. Whereas at Bank of America, it's like, well, make money for the bank. That's not something you can really engage in, right? It's not something you're just earning a paycheck. So perceived organizational support is another big one in there. And that was another one with USA versus Bank of America. Because we had so much high turnover, they actually didn't devote a lot of resources to supporting those people, those jobs. Development wasn't their first concern. Their first concern was making sure we had enough people. Whereas USA was like, no, we want you to grow. We want you to continue with the organization. So you'd have people, in fact, at one point, the CEO of USA had started as a call center representative. That was actually a thing. And he was the CEO for about 5 years. So it was, and people saw it. So it was really kind of cool. Another aspect is organizational factors. Here's where it becomes really complex. All the other aspects we've been talking about, you can point it to an individual, you can point it to a situation, you can point it to a task or something that you're trying to achieve a specific goal. But now when you get to organizational factors, wow, now we're talking about some really complex interactions, and it becomes really interesting to try to figure out some of the stuff that's going on. So for example, environmental determinants of well-being. How do you determine what is the best kind of environment to work in? Has anybody ever seen anything about the Google offices? Anybody seen? Pretty rad stuff, right? They have ping pong tables, they have a swing set, and they have a nap room, and they have their own full kitchens so you can go in and cook whatever you want. They have an arcade room, just all kinds of things you can do to distract yourself when you're stressed out and go do something fun in all these different areas. I've actually worked at a company where we had a room with little tents. You could go in and take a nap in these little tents. You would book out times. The maximum time you could book out was 20 minutes. And they had a little alarm clock in there. You go in, set the alarm, lay down on a pillow and a mattress, and just snooze for 15 minutes. Power nap. It was pretty awesome. But how do we support you in the environment? How does the environment support the workers? And is it worthwhile? While we talk about the Google office place and all these fun things that they do, guess what is also not cool about the Google offices? Totally open office space. There are no cubicles. There are no walls. It looks like this. You have a computer at a desk, and it looks like this. There's some little funky designs for the patterns of the areas, but it is completely open. So you do not hide from anybody. You can't go in your cubicle and surf Facebook for a little while. You have to be working when you're on the floor because everybody can see you. And so that's why they have all these little rooms and stuff, because they know that is stressful. You will get your work done. You will work. But guess what? You are going to be stressed and you need to relieve stress. So they put in these things to help you do that. So there's all kinds of these environmental determinants of how you feel about your job. Has anyone ever worked in a large call center environment before? When you were there, what's it like when you first started?
Boys.
You can't do anything.
Yeah.
You can't think. Because it's like this, but it's everybody's talking at the same time on the phone. And you've got a headset and you're trying to talk to somebody on the phone at the same time. It's nearly impossible. How long did it take you before you didn't listen to it anymore?
It didn't take long. I just switched. One ear was one language, the other
Yep.
a different language, and away we go.
And what's that process called for all you psychology people? Desensitization, thank you. So yeah, sensory desensitization, you get used to it really quickly. But that environment, even if it's there, it's still very stressful. Even though you get used to it, it puts a toll on. For a little while, I was Mr. Bus Driver. I drove a school bus for Tempe Elementary School District K-3, K-12, sorry. No, it was K-3. And I worked there for about 4 years, and I was never, I thought it was a fun job. I could drive a school bus. It's kind of cool. Big 40-foot yellow thing. I got all these kids that would, little elementary kids were always the best. They'd, hi, Mr. Bus Driver. Hi, Mr. Bus Driver. It was great. But driving one of those things in traffic is incredibly stressful because you are invisible. I had 13 accidents. None of them were my fault. All of them are people running into my bus. 13 accidents in 4 years. I was a little high, I admit, but no fatalities. We're good. And when I quit, finally, like the next week, I had more energy. I wasn't getting sick anymore. It was like, what the heck? I didn't even realize how much stress was on my body and my mind from doing this job. So yeah, even little things, that was a job I enjoyed. And I was still just super stressed all the time. I didn't even realize it. So these environmental determinants, you never know what they're going to be until you start really looking at it. Work-family conflict, long hours, few breaks, when do you get home? My son right now, the welding job, guess how far he has to drive to get to his work? 42 miles one way. He's on Deer Valley and I-17. So from where we live, that's 42 miles. And let me tell you what, that creates some conflict for him. He has to leave at 4:15 in the morning, no later than 4:15 because his work starts at 5 o'clock. So we see him when he comes home for a couple hours and then he goes to bed. So we don't, there's a lot of, if he was married with kids, what kind of a life would that be? He'd never get to spend any time. So huge work-family conflict, and that wouldn't be an appropriate job for him. Then there's things like workplace violence. How do you manage workplace violence? Because it does happen, it will happen, whether you like it or not. What are the factors that go into that? How do you mitigate it? Then you can look at things like groups versus teams. Groups of people that all work in the same area versus teams that share similar goals and projects. How do those work? And the social influence within groups. How do groups develop? Norming, forming, storming. The group decision-making process, groupthink, things like that. Virtual teams. I've been 20 years, I've been working from home and all my teams are virtual teams. How do you work with those? How do those develop? Very different from a team where you get together and meet face to face. And then there's also all kinds of organizational theory and organizational development and how that all goes into it. I put this up for a reason. It's complex. We're talking about organizational level stuff. There are so many factors that go in there. And so you have to, as an organizational psychologist, pick what factors am I going to pay attention to? What factors are the ones that matter in this analysis? What are the factors that are making a difference or that are not making a difference? And be able to winnow those things out. Really, really difficult. So what I want to do is spend a little time right now talking go a little deep dive in one aspect of which is pretty fun, which is leadership. Leadership is a big study for IO psychology because it's central to a lot of the tenets of organizational development. If you have good leaders, you have better organizations. Poor leaders, you have poor organizations because leaders are the ones that sort of shape all of that. So when we're talking about leadership, what we want to be able to do is study it and find out what makes a good leader, what makes a bad leader. And there's all kinds of things that go into it. So I'm going to ask you guys, how would you define leadership?
Consistent.
Consistent leadership? Consistent what?
They're consistent.
Okay, a leader is consistent doing the right thing. That's an excellent definition. What else?
Without friendlies.
Looks out for others. Yes, very much so. Proactive. Give me a little more on that one.
There is a problem, they will solve it.
Check out the DJ Revolver. Yeah. Organized. Okay.
Knowledgeable of the tasks and the organization.
Interesting. I'm gonna try to get back to that. Yeah.
Knows it, but they show up their members.
Okay.
I was gonna say, manages and like, I guess manages.
Manages. We are actually going to talk about that specifically and the difference between leadership and management.
Well, I mean, leadership is just making a decision or making a series of decisions from the top that impacts your I guess your people you're leading. Right?
Okay. Well, we're going to get back to a specific theory of leadership and a specific definition in a little bit. When we look at leadership, we look at different aspects of leadership. What makes a leadership? What are the traits that we see in leaderships? What are the behaviors that we see in leaders? And contingencies. What are some of the things that go on around them in leadership? We do a lot of research on leadership. Some very fruitful directions for leadership right now is gender in leadership. For example, female leaders are looked at less favorably than male leaders, even by other females. That's on average. That's not necessarily a specific thing, but on average, female leaders are looked at less favorably than male leaders, regardless of gender. Doesn't matter. Which is counterintuitive. You would think that if you had a female leader with female people that are following her, that they would look at her favorably because it's gender normativity. But no, that's the exact opposite. There's a bunch of other things that go on like that. Culture and leadership. What kind of leadership factors matter in different, not only organizational cultures, but even national cultures? And then emotions and leadership. How do emotions affect and how are emotions affected by leadership? So, of those two people up there, who would you say is a better leader? I don't like either of them, so neither of them. It's okay. You might say LeBron. You might say Prince Charles. Yeah, I was going to say George, but that's not George. Prince Charles. Okay, so totally different domains, though. How do you judge? One's a leader on the basketball floor during a game. The other's a leader of a whole country, but he doesn't really have much leadership. He's more of a figurehead. So is he actually a leader or is he not? We don't know. What about this one? Who's a better leader? Now, let me give you the case. How many people are influenced by the Pope's decisions worldwide? It's a very large number. I don't know the number of Catholic people in the world, but it is a very large number. And he has political influence. So when he speaks, not only do Catholics listen, but everybody that has political influence listens, because guess what? He influences the people that they're politicians over. Hugely influential. Elon Musk, potentially the richest man in the world, certainly has the most successful electric car company in the world and the most successful space company in the world, and may or may not be a nice guy. But do people pay attention when he talks? Even if you don't like him, do you pay attention to when he talks? Kind of. What about Putin? Kind of a jerk. I mean, he's started a war, sure, but he's also in charge and has almost direct control over one of the largest economies in the world. And by any stretch of the imagination, he is as powerful a man in the world as there is. So when he makes decisions, the whole world pays attention because he's got his finger on the trigger of a lot of nuclear bombs too. So there's all kinds of reasons why he's a good leader. So which one is better? Yeah, there's not an answer to that to say. You can also look at this. Who was a greater leader? These are all some very influential people. For those of you that do not know, this is Louis XIV, who was king of France for over 40 years and is largely responsible for taking France into the modern era, more or less, and was also directly responsible for the largest economy in the world at the time of his life, and was an absolute ruler of it. You ever want to have fun, go to Versailles in France and look at how many statues and paintings the man had of himself. Also an egomaniac. This is also, for those of you that aren't history buffs, Winston Churchill, George Washington, Mahatma Gandhi, MLK, and Abraham Lincoln. All of them were incredible leaders for one reason or another, right? Can you decide which one was greater than another? You might have a preference, but that's a really hard question to answer, and there is no answer to some of these questions. I'm throwing these as curveballs to you so you can think about how complex it is to look at a leader and say, are they good? Are they great? Who's better than another? And guess what? There's no way to decide any of that stuff. I could even put up a picture of, I wanted to put a picture of just a question mark and say, who do you think is the greatest leader you've ever worked with, that you've ever been influenced by personally? And it doesn't have to be at work. It could be somebody from your school. It could be somebody from an organization you've been affiliated with. It could be a friend, somebody that has been super influential to you. What made them influential to you? Why would you look at them and say, yeah, they were a great leader? And you probably have stronger feelings about that person than anybody up on this, because it's more personal. So define leadership. Well, historically, we've had a whole bunch of definitions. In the early 1900s, we emphasized control, power, and domination. So we looked at leaders when they were strong, dominant leaders. And if you think about historically, that's kind of what we looked at. You know, that was World War I into the Great Depression, and leaders were people that were building empires, that were building these huge organizations, and so the worker wasn't really that much of a thing. And so we looked at who had the most control, the most power. In the 1930s, we started to look more at personality traits, not so much on their influence and their power. In 1940s, we started to look at the behavior of individuals and how they directed other groups. So we're starting to look at how people act, not who they are. In the 1950s, we started to look at group theory and the relationships that developed from leaders and followers. And in the 1960s and 70s, we started looking more at organizations. How do leaders affect organizations and the goals that organizations have? And then in the 1980s, we started to focus more on information on trait theories and the transformational process. And now there's a big focus on leadership versus management and how those two things fit together. So if you want a good definition, a broad definition of leadership, there it is. And it kind of fits a lot with what you guys are talking about and how you saw leaders early. Leadership is a process whereby someone influences a group of other someones to achieve some type of common goal. This is obviously very broad. And the reason for that is because we have so many different factors that enter into leadership. We can look at things like global influences, which are now more prevalent than ever because our planet is so much smaller than it ever has been. To transmit information back in the early 1900s from one place to another took a serious amount of effort, and it was very rare to do that. Today, I can set up the Zoom with my best friend in New Zealand. You know, he's in the future, he's tomorrow, and I can still Zoom with this guy, and it costs me nothing. Well, I guess it costs me my cable bill, but it doesn't cost me any significant expense. And so information travels everywhere, and the global influence of all that information is tremendous. There's generational differences in how people prefer leadership. Gen X and actually baby boomers have a very different perception of what they want as a leader versus what millennials want as a leader. And those differences are fairly stark, to be honest. There's the changing ethical landscape. Things that were totally fine to talk about and mention and not worry about 20 years ago. Not anymore. Those are now big concerns. One of those being gender fluidity. That was not a concern 20 years ago. Wasn't even on the radar hard. You may have talked about homosexuality occasionally, and it was kind of discussed. But now, I've filled out forms for applications, job applications, where they ask me, and I have a list of 16 or so different genders that I could choose from, which one I am, what's my sexual orientation, and that's a concern now when they're hiring because they want to know that kind of information. So very different ethical landscape. Technological landscape. As more technology becomes more capable, you're seeing greater reliance on virtual technologies. There are now some really interesting versions of like Meta, for example, is trying to put together the VR where you can meet as groups in virtual reality. So that's going to be a thing that's coming up pretty soon. And then, of course, the changing cultural landscape that kind of encompasses all that. Now, there are various leadership styles. This is one view of leadership styles. There's a certain test that we could take in here if we wanted to, where I would give you a test that you would rate yourself on two different axes. This would be people, and this would be task orientation. And so somewhere in there, you'd come up with where you're at. When I give this test to my students in my psych classes, everybody's over here. Everybody. And a few people are over here, barely in country club, but almost everybody's in team leader because that's what they think they like the most. Now you might look at that and think, okay, what are these different leadership styles? I would probably go with country club or team leader, but I would never want to be authoritarian or impoverished. Those are terrible. No, actually, that's completely false. Let me define what they are. Country club means that you are more concerned with people than tasks. Who would be what's a job that you would want to have that kind of orientation for that kind of a job? Anybody have any idea?
Extrovert?
What's that?
Extrovert?
An extrovert? Not the type of person, the type of job.
Oh.
What type of employment would be really good with country club style leadership? What's that? Therapists? Very much so. Childcare? Very much so. How about human resources? HR? Your entire definition of your job is country club. You have to be concerned about the people that are there. Team leaders, okay? That's when you are both focused on the task and the people. You want to be with the team. You're leading a team toward a common goal. Pretty self-explanatory. What about authoritarian? You're more concerned about the task than you are about the people. Who would be? What kind of a job do you think that would be more important to have?
Welder.
Well, yeah, but as a leader, when you're doing the task, you're certainly concerned about the task. But what about the leader of people that are? Yeah. Military. Bingo. Okay, guys, we're going to go fight the enemy. So I want to make sure we're all happy before we go in there. So is everybody good? We're all good? We're all good? Ready? No. Ready? We're going to go. Now, you move. You cannot have a country club or a team leader philosophy in a high stress, high pressure environment. Military is not it. If you're in a high production facility where you have to get stuff made and you're on a deadline, you cannot be a country club or a team leader. You have to be authoritarian because you have to get the job done. Sometimes, well, actually we'll go back. Impoverished. What about that? Impoverished means that you don't much care about the task and you don't much care about people. Right? That's the definition by what we're talking about on this grid. What if you are the leader of a team of people that are very skilled and very motivated? They don't want you in their way. They want you out of the way. They don't want you messing with them. So you have to be impoverished to be effective with a group like that. So in actuality, a truly good leader can cycle through all of these, depending on the situation, the people, and the organization. Because some people, you might need me to be impoverished. You don't want me hovering over you all the time. And you want me to be a cheerleader for you. And you want me to lead you and have a common goal. So and you Somebody else is lazy. I got to be authoritarian for that guy. You know, so I will use all of these in different times and different situations. So being a leader isn't about having a single style. Being a truly good leader is about adapting to the situation and the circumstances. So when we describe leadership, we can have two general definitions. One of them is trait definition. And that's where we look at what do we see in leaders? When we study leaders, what are the traits we see most commonly? Or we can look at it and say it's process. And that's that interaction between the leader and the follower. How do they interact together? What is the process? What is going on in that interaction? By the way, just so you know, these are listed in order of most frequently discovered as the most important traits for a leader. Are they surprising? Yeah. The best leaders that we look at when we look at their traits, and also, by the way, when people rank leaders and how effective those leaders are, height is the number one, intelligence is 2, and attractiveness is 3. And by the way, whether they wear glasses or not is on the list. Primarily because if you wear glasses, you're perceived as being more intelligent than people that don't wear glasses. Now, for those of you that were in Psych 101, you might have heard this. The intelligence is great up to a point. At what point does your intelligence become a malfactor? Above an IQ of 120. Because at that point, you're more than one standard deviation above average intelligence, and now you think so differently than other people, they don't get you anymore. So once you pass an IQ of 120, your people don't understand you, and you don't understand them, and you are now no longer an effective leader. Isn't that the most bizarre thing? So trait definition is kind of fun. So there are different approaches to leadership that we can look at, and these are different ways that people will try to be leaders. Now, the one that is currently the most popular in corporate America is either authentic or spiritual leadership. Excuse me, not spiritual. Authentic or servant leadership, not spiritual. Servant leadership is the dominant leadership model for the U.S. military. All aspects of military leadership, if you are not considered a servant leader, you are not moving up the ranks, period. That's it. And to a lesser extent, that is also the U.S. government. And the idea behind servant leadership is that you are helping your followers achieve their maximum potential. And if that means that they surpass you and get promoted above you, that's fantastic. That means you just did your job because you helped that person achieve their maximum potential. That's why servant leadership is looked at as so important for the military, because they want people to achieve as much as they possibly can. Authentic leadership is a big one because people want to have leaders. And by the way, it's also one of the very influential traits is if you feel like your leader is genuine and authentic, not only with their communication with you, but also about who they are and how they feel about you, then that is looked at as a more effective leader. So authentic leadership is actually a little tough to do, believe it or not, because when you get into a leadership position, you often try to be the leader instead of being authentic with yourself and people that you follow. Something that takes a little bit of study. Adaptive leadership is kind of what we were talking about before, where you are more capable of adapting to different circumstances. But the two that feel the best to the followers are the servant leadership and authentic leadership. There's different types of power that make people leaders. When we were looking at those earlier examples of who's a better leader, who's not, each one of them had different types of leadership. One of the biggest ones is referent power. And that is one that you identify yourself. A referent power means that people look to you as a leader, regardless of anything else. So you could think of these as celebrities, right? You might, I'm going to be really dumb here for a second because I don't know enough. But for those of you that are Swifties, right, you may engage in some types of behaviors, like you may go see her movie. for her concert, which is now like setting all kinds of records. You may use products that she recommends. You may dress in ways that she's dressed. And she becomes a referent power because you've seen what she does and you like her. You think she's awesome. And so you do the things that she does. You use the things that she uses. You go places where you can associate with her. That's referent power. Expert power is another one. These are people, the brainiacs. These are people that know what's going on. All of your professors have expert power because that's our job. We're supposed to be the ones that know. So we come up here and we lecture about stuff. So we have that automatically, we have expert power because we know, and it can also be competence. You can be on a job and somebody just is really good at their job. And so they become a leader because that's what they do. They're so good at what they do that you want to emulate them. Then you can have legitimate power, which is a title. Manager, director, CEO. Those are all legitimate power because now they've been granted authority by an organization to be able to accomplish certain things. Then there's reward power. Parents have reward power. Clean your room and I give you ice cream. So you have the power to reward somebody for doing something. Lots of interpersonal relationships are based on sort of the reward power. Then there's coercive power, power to punish other people. Police have both a legitimate power for what they do and the coercive power. Do you want to get pulled over by a cop and get a ticket? No. But when you not only do they have the coercive power, but they also have legitimate power where they can pull you over because that's their job. You see those red lights in the mirror. Hey, classical behavior. You're being trained to automatically pull over. Then you have information power, and that's just having more information than everybody else does about something else. So your professors could either be expert or information power, depending on the domain. So every leader you've ever been working with, every leader you've ever known, has at least one of these types of power and can have several types of these power, all at the same time. For example, Elon Musk has expert power. Whether you like it or not, the man's a brilliant engineer. He knows his stuff. He is absolutely brilliant. He also has reward and coercive power. He can hire and fire people. And he has legitimate power because he's the freaking owner of the company. And he also has this information power because he knows more about his company than most other people do. He plays an active role now. So he has pretty much all of them. And guess what? There are also Tesla fanboys out there, and he has referent power for those. I don't know if you've ever run into a Tesla fanboy, but they're kind of fun. Now, there is a difference between leadership and management. Leadership is what produces change and direction. They will move people toward a goal. They can change the direction of a goal. But management is all about producing order and keeping things consistent. So managers can also be leaders and leaders can also be managers, but it is much more efficient to separate those ideas and have people that are leaders lead and have people that are managers manage. The lines get blurred a lot in corporate America, but that is the most efficient application of that. Let the managers manage stuff and let the leaders plan and do stuff to make the organization move forward. So again, the lines blur a lot, but it does have some problems. Quick question. Do we want to have a question and answer session at the end? Yes. How much time do we want for that?
Maybe
Maybe 50 minutes? So about now? Okay. We can stop here. Some major leadership traits. We already talked about this a little bit. This is a slightly different list. But this is leadership traits that we've discovered beyond those that are more appearance related and are the types of things that we see when we consistently look at really effective leaders. We find that they are in fact intelligent. They are above average intelligence for the most part. They have a certain amount of self-confidence. If you're going to be an effective leader, you have to be able to trust in your own ability to lead. If you don't have that self-confidence to lead, guess what you're not going to do? You're not going to lead. You're not going to want to be the one leading, or you're going to be reluctant about it, and then you're not going to be as effective at that. You also have to have a certain amount of determination, because as a leader, guess what's going to happen? You're going to fail at least once. It's going to happen, period. And guess what? That happens to all of us. So no surprise, right? But in order to, when you fail as a leader, you have to have a strong sense of determination, because you cannot say, oh, okay, I failed. I'm done. All right. Next. Your turn. That's not a great leader either. They have to have the self-confidence to be determined. They also will have integrity, meaning that they make decisions that are for the good of the organization and for the good of the people, of the people in the organization. Integrity can be very broad. You can have integrity towards, say, the larger culture, towards the environment, towards the people in the organization, towards the people that the organization serves. You can define that however you want, but the good leader understands what level of integrity is the most important to the people that they're leading, and they respond appropriately. And the last one is sociability. A good leader is someone who's just straight up likable. They're able to go in and talk to you. They're able to go in and understand who you are, what you're trying to do, and how you're going to function. So those are, if you want to look at being a leader, this is a pretty good solid list to start with. I have a few more slides that talk more about some other styles of leadership, but we don't need to go there. I think we've gotten there far enough. So I am now going to open it up to questions from you guys. Anything you want to know about either leadership or IO psychology or rock climbing or whatever, I don't know. Lay it on. Yeah.
Would you give an example between leadership and management? How you split those?
How would I split those?
Yes.
Yeah, a leader would be somebody who would say, we are going to achieve 20% growth this year with this new type of client. They're setting a goal for the organization. They're saying, okay, we are looking to expand, and that expansion means we have to get all of our ducks in a row. We have to start looking at how we're going to get this expansion. And so they start looking at the strategic look of how to do all of this. A manager would be the one that says, oh, I see the strategy. Now I'm going to go with the tactics. Okay, so if the strategy is this, then I've got a team of people. What do we need to do as a team to help meet those goals? So they're going to manage the individuals within a small team and to do things like managing budget, managing who's got what role they're going to achieve, managing the performance of those individuals. Like, you don't want the CEO of an organization doing the personnel performance review of everybody in the organization. You do that through managers, because it's a strategic vision versus a tactical application. Does that make sense? Okay. So, question. What's that? It was there. I that's actually it. I saw people climbing. I'm like, that looks super cool, and so I tried it out and I loved it. So yeah, me and my kids do it all the time. So, what else? Any other questions? Yes.
Have you, because I'm not gonna word this fast, but basically not myself within companies that I've worked with, but hearing other people talk about companies where I'm like, where's your HR? Oh my gosh, those moments. Have you ever been kind of going over and helping a company where you're just there are so many red flags?
Yes. What's interesting about that idea is that every company, every organization, no organization is perfect. Let's put it that way. Every organization is going to have things that they do really well and things that they do really poorly. And that's part of what an industrial and organizational psychologist will do, is to help go in and identify, okay, well, you want to improve, and they won't usually say, can you look at our organization and tell us how we suck? That's not how they're going to approach it. They're going to say, we think that there's some difficulty with HR. Can you come in and help us identify what's going wrong? And as an IO practitioner, when you come in and do that, what you'll probably come away with is maybe one or two very specific thing they can improve on. You're not gonna be able to say, well, let's overhaul this bad boy and we're gonna start from the ground up. They'll never pay you for that, first of all. And second of all, that's too much. So you can improve incrementally. So that's kind of what an IO psychologist is doing, is figuring out what's the biggest pain point and how do we improve that pain? And that's usually our target. Does that make sense?
If I were looking at this as a career, I have some questions about what your employment history looks like. Like, it sounds like you've worked for a number of companies.
Yes.
I'm curious, how many places have you lived? Have you ever moved for a job?
No. I've worked, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I'm now going to be going into my 8th company since I started my career. I have never had to move. I found all my jobs here in Arizona. And a quick fun story of one of my jobs, when I worked for USAA, I was recruited to go over there. I wasn't looking for a job. They sent somebody and said, hey, we'd like to have you come over. I'm like, okay. And so when they're interviewing me, they're like, hey, the job's in San Antonio. Can you move to San Antonio? No. All right, we'll get back to you. So then they get back to me. Yeah, there's an office. It's in Phoenix. It's on Happy Valley Road in I-17. Can you go to that office? No, I'm not going to go to that office. That's too far away. Okay, we'll get back to you. All right, well, you can work from home. Okay, now we're going to so I've been very insistent on my hatred of commutes, and I've been lucky enough that all my employers have let me work remote. So in the last 3 jobs I've had, there wasn't even a question. There's like, oh, you're going to work remote? It's very possible now to have jobs that you are entirely remote. And in fact, once you get up into those management and above, it's very common to have. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you talked about going in on the front end and making assessments of problems that would be solved. And do IO psychologists ever come in afterwards and to evaluate whether or not progress has been made toward those goals?
Yes, that is also a big aspect, and that's especially true with larger projects. What's fun about things like that is at the beginning of a project, hopefully, even when you have an IO psychologist that come in and said, hey, here's your pain point, here's what we're going to solve that. Hopefully what you've done is you've said, what will success look like? So you go in and you say, okay, tell me what you want to achieve, and are there metrics that we can look at? There's got to be things other than, oh, that sounded good. There has to be things like, okay, they're going to perform at X amount better. They're going to do something in a shorter period of time. They're going to do something more often. They're going to stop doing something they were doing before. So we have these metrics that we look at. So then after we've gone in and tried to fix things, then we go back later and say, okay, we have the metrics of what success looks like. Did we meet those metrics? Let's take a look at them and see how we did. And so, yeah, we will always go back, and that's the goal. Unfortunately, I will say this, in corporate America, there's lots and lots of money for starting projects, and there's lots of time to get the project going, but there's less time and money to evaluate the project in fact. My favorite thing to do, and it's the least common thing I've ever done, is evaluation. That sounds so weird. Like everybody wants to get going, but then it's like, yeah, let's evaluate. No, we don't have time. We're on the next project. So it's a really bizarre thing. I think it's so important to be able to have that evaluation, but time is money. And they don't want to mess with that. Yeah.
What would you say is the most common flaw in a leader?
That is a really good question. The most common flaw in a leader is probably it's probably going to be not understanding the people they lead. I think that's going to be the most common flaw. The second most common flaw will be harder to identify, and it would be hubris. Basically, hubris, pride in their own position, and not being able to understand that they're not the only person. Which I've seen that a lot.
Have you ever run into this, like going into a situation where you're hired a public company and the problem is the owner.
Thank goodness, no. Actually, that is what you can do is you can come at that from a different direction. You don't say, you know what, your CEO's lousy. What you end up doing is you say, okay, what seems to be the difficulty? By the way, this is the case with anything. Whenever you come to an organization, you can't come into an organization and say, guess what? What we found was you suck at this. What you have to say is, okay, you will find a better result if you do this. That's how you couch it. You don't ever cast blame. You don't ever point the finger. You say, if you were to change this, you will have a better result. And so with the CEO, you say, your strategic vision, if it was this direction, would probably lead to a better result than your current strategic vision. Or whatever the CEO's problem is. You can try to identify it and say, if you did this a little better, you'd be okay. So yeah, you never ever point fingers. You never ever cast blame, because as soon as you do that, what have you just done? You've just told the people that are paying you, you suck. And they aren't going to pay you anymore for that. That's no fun for anybody, even though you really want to something. Yeah.
I don't know how to structure this question, but it's about you getting this information of how to help a companies. It will be the same, or it will be applying the same in the United States, and it was in a different country because of the culture of that.
Right. I see. Are there different recommendations I would make based on cultural differences in the company or things like that? Is that kind of what you're going on? Yes, 100% yes. In fact, we did some work with a company, Canada Rail, the national rail company of Canada, and the cultural differences between their organization and all the organizations we'd ever been in the United States was dramatic. You would think that we all speak English, we're all part of North America, but no, it wasn't even close. It took a large adjustment from our side to even wrap our brains around how their culture worked. It was really, really different. And you run into that, in fact, in other ways, even within the United States. For example, I was recently working with a tech corporation, and in a tech company, and this is, I hope this doesn't sound insensitive in any way, but about 70% of the people working in most programming jobs are Indian, from Indians. And they have a very different way of thinking about things than Americans do. And especially first generation ones that just come over from India, they got their education in India, now here. And so working with people from different cultures, even within a different organization in the United States, can be very challenging. And to be able to learn how to talk to those people is something you have to learn how to do anew every time you run into a new culture. I had another job with a transportation company, and oddly, their tech people were all Cuban, Brazilian, and Venezuelan. How that happened, I have no idea. But and it was just super fun to have this totally different organization with all these different people that were not typical for an IT organization. It was totally crazy. So I had to readjust myself. So yeah, 100% different whenever you're working with different cultural attitudes. Yeah. Yeah.
How did you choose this field of study? Why did you choose it?
I sort of stumbled on it accidentally. One of the things I tell people from my students is when you're exploring what you want to do for a living, and even when you're doing your education, every semester take one class for no other reason than you're like, that looks cool. Like you don't need to, it doesn't need to fit into anything. To say, underwater basket weaving? Never tried that? Let's give that a shot. And I was working on a different degree, and I took a class in in developmental psychology, and it blew my mind. I loved it so much. So I started going, psychology. Anything is psychology. Psychology, what's psychology? So then it was educational psychology, and that wasn't quite it. And then I started looking at some other different versions of it, and I stumbled across IO psychology. I'm like, well, that's the stuff. Yeah, that's hitting that itch right back there. And so, yeah, I discovered accidentally a love for psychology, and within that, I discovered this field through experimentation and finding what I like. Yeah.
Is there a section of this field that deals specifically with organizations interacting with other organizations?
Yes.
That are from different cultures?
Yes. It's not common though. That's what it will be is you would have to be embedded within an organization. And if they're doing work with another organization, then they would call you in and say, hey, we need your help understanding how to work with this other organization. Very, very rare, but it does happen. One last question. Yeah.
My question was a little bit niche, maybe a little bit, yeah, in an earlier topic. But you mentioned something about folks with higher IQs being less effective leaders because they think really differently.
Yes.
I've heard a lot of sort of divergent thoughts about the efficacy of IQ tests. I was wondering if you had a thought about that or someone we could read to learn a little bit more about.
You're asking somebody who is I've done a lot of research on this and a lot of reading on this. There is no aspect of psychology that has been more tested, more rigorously, with more robust results than intelligence testing. Any arguments about that are usually stretching things like ethics of it or something like that. But the actual tests, they're literally, and this is actually the truth. There is not any aspect of psychology that has better evidence, that is more robust than intelligence testing, period. And so when people say, oh, it doesn't have much efficacy, bull. You're looking at it from a different perspective. You're not looking at it from just intelligence. You're looking at it from some kind of ethical consideration, which can be legitimate. But IQ testing, when it's done, we know it tests intelligence. General intelligence is absolutely 100% a thing. And those differences in intelligence are absolutely 100% a thing. Now, where's the origin of that? What do you do about all that? That's debates for philosophy. But the actual testing of intelligence, it's unassailable, in my opinion.